If you think shadow work is about journaling your negative emotions, you've completely missed the point. And you are not alone. Most of people teaching shadow work today have never actually read Jung. I'm Daniel. I've spent more than 20 years studying authentic Jungian psychology, but also yoga, spirituality, and mythology. Not just the Instagram version, but the real stuff. Transformative work that Jung actually described. Today, we are going back to the source texts to understand what shadow work really is and why the popular interpretations are not just wrong, but potentially dangerous. What you will learn: the 4 critical mistakes everyone makes, Jung's actual method, and why surface-level shadow work keeps you stuck. This isn't feel-good spirituality. This is the real work of becoming whole. Let's start with what shadow work is not. It's not writing "I'm angry" in your journal and calling it shadow integration. It's not positive thinking, disguised as depth psychology. And it's certainly not the weekend workshop version where you heal your shadow in 3 easy steps. The real shadow, as Jung described it, isn't just your negative emotions. Listen to what he actually said. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Notice, he said making conscious, not healing, not fixing, not getting rid of. Most of what passes for shadow work today is actually surface psychology, dealing with emotions and reactions rather than the deep unconscious complexes that actually run our lives. Here is why this matters. When people think they've done shadow work by journaling their feelings, they are actually engaging in spiritual bypassing, using pseudo-psychology to avoid real transformation. I see this constantly. People who think they've integrated their shadow in 6 months, walking around inflated, believing they've transcended their unconscious patterns. Meanwhile, they are projecting their shadow all over the place, just now with spiritual language. The real tragedy is they are missing the gold, the actual treasures hidden in the shadow that authentic methods can access. The creative potential, the suppressed life force, the qualities they've disowned that could actually transform their lives. Here is an uncomfortable truth. Most shadow work teachers have never studied Jung beyond Wikipedia. They've taken a weekend courses, maybe read The Dark Side of the Light Chasers, and think they understand the depth psychology. There is a massive difference between pop psychology and authentic depth psychology. When you are dealing with the unconscious, with forces that can literally overwhelm the ego, and proper training and credentials really matter. Jung himself worked with seriously disturbed patients. This isn't a game. Let me read you what Jung actually wrote in the book Memories, Dreams, Reflections. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. Notice that word, moral. This isn't therapy, this isn't self-improvement, it's a moral challenge to your entire sense of who you are. Jung distinguished between personal shadow and the collective shadow. These are completely different phenomena. The personal shadow contains your disowned personal qualities. The collective shadow contains dark potentials of humanity itself. But there is what most people miss. The shadow has a compensation function. It's not evil to be eliminated, it's the psychic balance. to your conscious attitude. As Jung said, the shadow is simply the whole unconscious. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator, developed the most practical approach to shadow work. She discovered that fairy tales reveal shadow patterns better than introspection ever could. Why? Because projection is the royal road to the shadow. You can't see your own shadow directly, it's literally behind you, but you can recognize it in your reactions to others, in the stories that triggers you, in the characters you despise in fairy tales and myths. Von Franz called this the transcendent function, when opposing forces in the psyche create growth through their tension. The goal isn't to resolve the tension, but to hold it consciously. Let me give you an example from Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales. She analyzed how we recognize the shadow witch in stories. Not as an eternal evil, but as a disowned aspect of the feminine psyche that contains both destructive and creative power. Now, Jung's actual method, active imagination. This is not a guided meditation, this is not visualization, this is dialoguing with autonomous psychological figures that emerge from the unconscious. You engage these shadow figures not to control them, but to encounter them. You maintain what Jung called the ethical standpoint, remaining conscious during the encounter rather than being possessed by the shadow content. But here is Jung's warning, and I want you to hear this clearly. This isn't safe for everyone. Jung worked with people who had psychotic episodes during this work. If you have a history of mental instability, you need professional guidance. The ethical dimension is really crucial. Shadow work requires moral courage because you are going to discover things about yourself that challenge your self-image. As Jung said, individuation is not happiness. The first massive mistake is thinking the shadow is just your negative emotions. The shadow contains unlived potential, not just rejected negativity. There's what Jung called the golden shadow, positive qualities you've disowned. The overly nice person who's buried their assertiveness, the intellectual who's rejected their body, the rational person who's denied their intuition. The shadow isn't what's wrong with you, it's what's missing from your conscious life. The second mistake is thinking you can do shadow work in isolation. Projection is essential. You literally cannot see your own shadow directly. Relationship and conflicts are where shadow work happens. The person who triggers you, they are carrying your shadow projection. The qualities you most despise in others, those are shadow indicators. And I see a lot of spiritual hermits who think they've transcended their shadow because they have eliminated conflicts from their lives. They often have the biggest blind spots because they've eliminated the mirrors that could show them their unconscious content. Real shadow work requires what I call mirror work, using others' reactions to you as a shadow indicators. If 3 people tell you you are controlling, the problem isn't with them, it's yours. Here is Jung's warning that nobody wants to hear. Individuation is not happiness. Shadow work isn't therapy. It's not about feeling better. It actually increases psychological complexity, not comfort. Jung used the symbol of cross for this process, the tension between opposites that creates growth through suffering. The horizontal bar represents the tension between conscious and unconscious. The vertical bar represents the tension between personal and transpersonal. This is the difference between therapeutic healing and individuation. Therapy helps you function better. Individuation makes you more conscious, which often makes life more complex, not easier. If your shadow work is making you feel good about yourself, you are probably doing it wrong. The fourth mistake is thinking shadow work can be completed quickly. Jung worked with the alchemical time frame, decades, and not more months or days. Premature integration is dangerous. I can see people claiming victory after a year of shadow work, inflated with their own spiritual progress. True shadow work has a spiral nature. You encounter the same complexes at the deeper levels throughout life. Franz said something really profound. The shadow work of the first half of life is just preparation. The real shadow work begins in midlife, when the ego is strong enough to hold the tension of opposites without collapsing. The American obsession with quick fixes has infected shadow work as well. And this is a lifelong process, not a problem to be solved. And here is the actual method. First, recognition through projection. What enrages you reveals your shadow. Not what mildly annoys you, what triggers a disappropriate emotional response. Try to make a list of people who strongly dislike. What specific qualities trigger you? Those qualities are the shadow indicators. Jung called this the 3 rule. If you notice the same quality bothering you in 3 different people, it is definitely yours. This requires radical honesty. You have to be willing to own the worst in humanity as potentially yours. As Jung said, the shadow is 90% pure gold, but you have to dig through a lot of shit to find it. Once you've identified shadow content, you dialogue, you open a discussion with it through active imagination or through the dreams or insight and meditation. Create a conversation with your internal adversaries, not to get rid of them, but to establish conscious relationship. Maintain what Jung called the ethical standpoint. Stay conscious during the encounter. Don't let the shadow possess you, but don't try to control it either. Here is an example. Instead of trying to eliminate your inner critic, you create dialogue with it. Why are you so harsh? What are you protecting? What would happen if you weren't there? Often you discover the critic contains discriminating wisdom that's gotten twisted. If you start losing touch with reality, stop immediately and seek professional help. Some people need help to do this work safely. The final step is leaving the tension. You don't get rid of it. You can't get rid of shadow. You develop ongoing relationship with it. Jung called this transcendent function. Holding opposites without collapsing into either extreme. This means incarnation, bringing shadow qualities into conscious life in appropriate ways. The overly nice person learns to say no. The harsh person learns compassion. The rational person honors their emotions. But here is the key. This is ongoing. Shadow work isn't destination. It's a way of living with greater consciousness and authenticity. Let me give you a reality check. Real shadow work is uncomfortable, slow, and requires moral courage. Most people prefer the Instagram version because it's easier and makes them feel good about themselves. But if you want actual transformation, if you want to become more than just a well-adjusted person, if you want to access your full potential and live with authentic power, you have to do the real work. And if you are ready for authentic shadow work, start with source texts like Jung, von Franz, not the pop psychology. Read Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales. It will teach you more than a dozen self-help books. Remember, the path of individuation is not for everyone, and that's okay. But if it's calling you, if you are tired of surface level spirituality and ready for the real journey of becoming whole, then welcome to the work that will transform not just your life, but potentially the life of everyone around you. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more content that goes beyond spiritual consumerism, and we can go together into the depth of authentic transformation. The shadow work continues.